We're very fortunate today to have Professor Brian Grodsky of our own Department of Political Science. Professor Grodsky received his BA from the University of Colorado, and following that spent several years as a reporter and diplomat in Central and Eastern Europe. He then pursued graduate studies at the University of Michigan, from which he received his PhD in 2006. Brian has published in a number of leading journals. The talk he is giving today, The Costs of Justice, Understanding How New Leaders Choose to Respond to Previous Rights Abuses, is based on his book that has the same title and was recently published by the University of Notre Dame Press. So it should be a great talk. We're looking forward to it. And Brian, the floor is yours. You're going to speak for about 45 minutes?
About 45 to 50.
Okay, so, and then Brian has graciously agreed to take questions for a while.
Yep. All right, so thanks. I have most of you guys in class. You don't usually clap, so I'm starting early. So the title of my talk is The Cost of Justice, is based on my first book, which came out last January. The question that I asked in this book is what determines how a new or a nominally new regime will pursue transitional justice following a period of repression. What I mean by transitional justice is a series of symbolic and legal mechanisms that can be employed by new elites who come to power, who replace an abusive regime, so ostensibly democratic elites, to deal with past abuses. So legal and symbolic acts. This might sound a little vague, but it's not vague for someone like Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who was the first non-communist prime minister in the East Bloc when Poland had its semi-free elections in 1989. And he was confronted with this very question. And what he did in a parliamentary speech in 1989, a big speech that sort of echoed around the world, is he promised to, quote, draw a thick line on what has happened in the past. Well, this thick line, one of his advisors told me, quickly took on a life of its own, and everybody said, oh, Poland's going to turn the other cheek, they're going to let bygones be bygones, they're not going to deal with past human rights abusers. In fact, what was meant by this speech was that Solidarity, the incoming group, social movement turned political party, wanted to separate itself from the economic mismanagement of the communist regime from yesterday. So they wanted to say, from here on out, we're starting on a level plane. Don't blame us for all the bad things that happened before with respect to the economic situation. Now, again, this took on a life of its own, and I think what this highlights is the very opaque nature of transitional justice, ironically opaque nature of transitional justice in many post-abusive or post-repressive states. So the book that I've written really is designed to give us a way to read between the lines and try to be able to predict a little bit better how transitional justice processes are going to play out. Here you've got a picture of the most recent revolutions in Tunisia, followed by Egypt, followed by a series of yet incomplete processes. And here you've got a beautifully managed picture of Czechoslovakia. And look how they look so similar. Well, they were similar in a lot of ways. The dynamics of the changes, of course, differ in some important ways. But in many ways, these were people's revolutions, quote unquote. These were demands for change. And when these happened, all these elites, in all these cases, irrespective of what year they happened, were faced with the same common question. How do we deal with yesterday's rights abusers? So this is very much a pertinent question that goes on today. The answer, I argue in this book, is that whether they come to power through a revolution, through a negotiated transition, or some other way, new elites suddenly find themselves in these institutions that are quite sobering. The path of transitional justice is one of many that they have to deal with. Transitional justice isn't alone. It's not just a sole variable out there. They're dealing with economic problems, they're dealing with other political problems, with reforms more broadly. And so the way they're going to approach justice, I argue, the shape that justice is going to take is largely a function of how these new leaders believe that their constituents are going to perceive the justice policies that they enact, and especially how they perceive these justice policies as impacting on other political goods legislation and initiatives that are out there. Okay? So the basic gist is reopen the factories, provide for a decent standard of living for the people, ensure a social safety net. Once you deal with the present, then yeah, deal with the past, say the voters. And this is the sort of perception that new elites come to power and quickly grasp that they have to deal with. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the relevance of transitional justice, why we care, some of the arguments that are designed to predict the path of transitional justice, focusing on the central argument out there, which is relative power. I'll talk a little bit about my method of inquiry and then provide some evidence from Poland and Serbia. I'm not going to regale you with stories about victorious post-oppositionists who are hanging their post-oppressors from, I don't know, whatever they hang them from, telephone poles or something else. And I'm not going to talk about this reconciliation and how great it felt. Instead, I'm going to tell you what I want to get through is a different way of thinking about how these groups approach justice and how we might understand justice in a broader perspective. So we'll start with why we care. There are a variety of normative and strategic arguments for why we should care about justice. Right? And not all of these have a lot of empirical backing. The transitional justice literature is quite, it's a multidisciplinary literature, and there's empirical backing for some of these, not so much for others. Some of them are hard to actually back up. But in the literature, and generally within these societies, there's the proponents of transitional justice argue that, first of all, it enhances legitimacy. It shows that there's a break with the old regime. The new regime is something completely different. It can also be used to introduce new norms, the rule of law, everyone being accountable to the law. Well, that's a new norm in many of these post-repressive states, moving from non-democracies to democracies. And finally, and there are plenty more reasons out there, but among the key reasons is local and global stability, right? Deterrence. Show that we deal aggressively with justice now so that this doesn't happen again. Whatever happened in this country will not be repeated. Now, whether or not you agree with these, and again, the empirical evidence isn't always there. Okay? There's a lot of stuff out there, but not a lot of it's empirically driven. But the internationalization of justice has happened. It's here. If you look at, I mean, basically it rode on the coattails of human rights law. So by the early 1990s, transitional justice after the Cold War really blossoms. And what this means is that you had the ad hoc criminal tribunals set up. For the first time since Nuremberg, you had international tribunals set up for the former Yugoslavia and a sensible war, well, they were real war crimes, real accounts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. You had 1994, they set a war crime tribunal up for Rwanda, okay? And finally, this was really epitomized by the International Criminal Court, which has been in existence for about a decade now. It's only now getting up and running. And only recently, about a month or two ago, the Ivory Coast president was brought in as their first indictee, who was actually serving there. There's also another principle of universal jurisdiction. Forget about the international side. Our own judges and judges in other states frequently call upon those accused of human rights abuses in another state and demand that they serve, that they come to court in that particular country, wherever these judges are. Now, how successful are they? That's another, it's a mixed record, but they certainly pursue these things. Okay? US policy has been, well, we're not signatories of the International Criminal Court. We're not particularly, but we do support it frequently. More importantly, we are proponents of transitional justice in many cases. If you go to the State Department's website, you will find millions of dollar bounties on the heads of terrorists, but you'll also find multi-million-dollar bounties on the heads of war criminals. So we do take this into account in our policy. Now, having said that, if we actually care about this, if we think it's important, if it is here, and it is, right, the norms are here, the institutions are increasingly here, well then, the big question is, how do we actually influence this process in other countries? Right? How can we actually impact it in ways that are the most effective and the least politically destabilizing? And to do that, I think you really need to understand how these leaders themselves approach these issues when they face them. And so that's what I do in this book. The central argument in the literature, is that justice policies are determined by the relative power of new elites. So the stronger the new elites are, compared to those outgoing elites, the old elites, the more aggressively we should expect them to approach transitional justice. Again, hang them up on the telephone poles or wherever you can hang. Okay? The argument that I put forward in this book, based on media analyses and interviews, about 250 interviews in Serbia, Croatia, Poland, and Uzbekistan, is that transitional justice is really about more than this. It's about It's a function of the belief that it's a function of the perception that elites have of how political goods are going to be perceived as being provided despite this transitional justice happening. Right? And I know that sounds vague, and it probably sounds even vaguer the way I just put it. But the idea is that there are institutional incentives that these elites face when they're in power. Okay? And what they're going to be looking at is how these policies are perceived by their voters to affect the delivery of expected goods and services. And I'll make sure this isn't so confusing as I go through. So let's start with relative power arguments. There are basically three strands of the relative power argument. All these are focused on the strength of new versus old elites. The first one is the transition-based argument, and this is the most widely cited. Okay? Huntington came up with this in around 1991, and everyone has taken this as the gospel. And so you find this all over the place. The idea is intuitively appealing. What he says is that where you have basically the process of transition from non-democracy to democracy is what determines how transitional justice plays out. So where you have a negotiated transition, old elites had a degree of leverage, right? They had some bargaining power, and they could guarantee for themselves, with the incoming elites, an amnesty, or a role for themselves in the new system. Make sure that they have certain positions that will ensure that transitional justice is not an aggressive process that gets played out. Right? If you have a revolution, though, the old elites have very little say in their exit, and therefore they lack this leverage, and we should expect to find aggressive forms of justice taking place. So that's a transition-based argument. The state structure argument defines power a little more broadly. And here we're looking at old elites' associates within key power ministries. Think about the power ministries that were involved in the rights abuses. Things like the military, the police, the intelligence services. The question here is how these old elites' associates in these power ministries are going to be able to use force or the threat of force to keep transitional justice off of the agenda, or at least aggressive forms of transitional justice. Finally, you've got the public support argument, which incorporates the broadest definition of power. And here we're looking at society. So here we're talking about this idea that societal elements may have been somehow involved in past rights abuses, which is frequently the case. There are varying degrees of culpability, but they could have been collaborators, they could have been supporters, active supporters or passive supporters. Okay? And in these cases, we should expect to see aggressive forms of justice, harsh forms of justice taken off the agenda. Okay? So these are the relative power arguments that are out there. The focus on all three of these really is the threat of violence against the new regime, which keeps transitional justice mild, okay, in those particular instances. So relative power arguments do tell us a lot, but they also have become dated, and they're missing some important aspects that I want to shake out right now. First, they tend to overemphasize the short term. Let me emphasize right here that transitional justice is really a misnomer. It's not always just, and it's very, very rarely limited to the quote-unquote transition period. Transitional justice can go on and on. If you look in our Department of Justice, you will find Nazi hunters more than 70 years after they committed their crimes who are still being sought after. Okay? So we're still looking after these guys, looking for these guys. And this tends to take place in lots of states. It's not something that ends very quickly. So to look at the short term is I think, a big mistake. These also tend to be overly focused on weight of the past arguments. And by this we mean, where is the old regime? How did they go? What sort of abuses were taking place? When were the abuses taking place? The severity of the abuses. When so much about the transition is about the now, right? It's about people who have demands, who demanded a new regime, and they have expectations of that new regime, the politics of the present. There also tends to be an exclusive focus on domestic pressure. Right? And there's a good reason for that, because many of these arguments that have been cited over and over again are outdated. Okay? They took place before we had these international norms and institutions in place that really pursue transitional justice at another level. So international pressures are very much there. Finally, there tends to be an underspecified dependent variable. What I mean is, we don't know what transitional justice is exactly. If you're going to say there's a correlation between harsh forms of justice and the method of transition from non-democracy to democracy, A negotiated transition should lead to lenient forms of justice. If a revolution should lead to harsh forms of justice. Well, we can't really actually empirically test that until we flesh out what we mean by justice. There are lots of mechanisms of justice, and it's not just amnesties and criminal tribunals, which would make it easy. So the strategic argument that I propose in this book builds really on the public support argument in many ways of the relative power argument. But one thing that I do here is I pull justice off of the pedestal which it's been placed on. And I drop it into the messy political sphere where I think it really belongs. Justice, again, doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's one of many policies that new elites have to reckon with. What this means is that justice it competes with other policies for attention. It competes with them for resources. There are different ways of seeing and framing justice. Justice is multidimensional. So the strategic argument takes that a step further. And it also looks at justice in a slightly different way, from a rational choice institutional perspective. And what I mean is that new elites do what they need to in order to maintain power, which in part is a function of the institutions in which they're housed. The president is going to behave differently than a senator, for example. They have different constituent pressures, etc. But I also incorporate into this rational choice institutionalist perspective a heavy dose of reality, which is that these people come to power and they have their own agendas. They have their own private preferences. And what I assume here is that they all want to follow the most aggressive form of justice they can, as long as it doesn't impact them negatively politically. Okay? And there are lots of reasons for this. I just talked about various normative and strategic aspects of justice, why they should, quote unquote, want justice. But also remember that many of these people were the ones who were abused under the former system. They were the oppositionists under the former system, which is why they were abused. So they might want vengeance, right? They might want to knock out political opponents before they get to the polls, right? What better way to defeat your opponents than have them in jail so they can't even compete with you in the next elections? So there are those cynical, and there are also those more altruistic reasons to assume that they want to pursue aggressive forms of justice. Having said all that, I know I said a lot, there are three basic questions that these new elites are going to ask themselves as they go about pursuing justice policies. First of all, what do we need to provide citizens to be reelected? The answer, of course, being public goods. Political goods, I should say. By political goods, I mean an array of things that go from the tangible to the intangible, from the immediately connected to the more distant. So things like lowering unemployment, lowering inflation, right? Providing subsidies where you need them, okay? Ensuring that everyone has a water supply go into their house, okay? Public goods. Ensuring that the country can move into a security bloc so that there's greater security externally, or so that more investors come to that country, right? All these sorts of things. So what do they need to provide citizens to be reelected? What are their personal preferences with respect to justice policy, which again I assume is going to be the most aggressive they can possibly follow? And how might these preferred justice policies be construed by constituents as affecting the delivery of these political goods? So, all this depends on where new leaders sit. And I split this up into two different institutional types, primary and secondary institutions. By secondary institutions, I mean those characterized by a low degree of constitutional power. These are largely representative, symbolic, advisory officials. Okay? So they have a role in how the government performs, but it's not a hands-on role. They're not directly responsible for the allocation of political goods. And as a result, they have a low burden of governance. People aren't watching them like hawks, waiting for them to deliver because they don't have anything they can actually deliver. So think of this as the Queen of England, as the president in a parliamentary system, someone who has a role, but it's not the key role in terms of governance. Contrast this with actors in primary institutions. These are the ones who are characterized by a high degree of constitutional power. Back there you've got Blair, because that's the only one that I could find where the Prime Minister is sitting next to the Queen. The Prime Minister in a parliamentary system. This is the one responsible for implementing various laws, for executing the budget, right? Creating and executing the budget. This is the one responsible for getting investment in the country. This is the one responsible for cleaning up the streets, for getting crime off the streets, right? These are the ones with their hands on on the trigger. And so these actors are characterized by a high burden of governance. People watch them, people expect from them. What this means is they're going to approach justice in a different way. And this looks a lot more obnoxious than it really is. It's actually really simplistic. So, because primary actors are the ones responsible for the provision of political goods, citizens' expectations of them are very high. And the way they approach justice is going to be a bottom, where does justice fit into our bottom line? So over here, the first question they're going to ask themselves is this aggressive form of justice going to inhibit, or be perceived to inhibit, I should say, the delivery of political goods? Are citizens going to think that because I followed this, I was unable to provide political goods? If the answer is yes, then we're going to find that aggressive forms of justice are off the table. Okay? If the answer is no, if it's not going to be perceived to impede justice, then the next question is, where does the public stand on this? Okay? If public attitudes are not antagonistic, they might be supportive of aggressive forms of justice. They might want all the criminals to go to the gallows or whatever it may be, or they might just not care. They might not really pay attention. Well then, we should expect to find these new elites to follow a harsh or aggressive form of justice. In other words, criminal tribunals on a large scale, criminal prosecutions. Okay? So long as they can ensure that while doing this, their citizens are not going to suddenly say, hey, wait a second, you're spending too much time on this. Okay? Again, time is also a resource. Citizens don't want to see that wasted. Now, if public opinion is antagonistic towards justice, and it frequently is, then the question is, what can we do to essentially, let's put this in a really crass way, buy our constituents off? We want to pursue an aggressive form of justice. How can we convince our citizens it's in their best interest? Well, if you have otherwise unavailable public goods that you can, or political goods that you can connect to that aggressive form of justice, then you can go forward. If you can't, then you're going to see low levels of justice. And what I mean by these additional incentives, think about where the old regime goes. Think about if the old regime is seen as a source of crime in the new system. Well, if you go after them for past human rights abuses, you're also ensuring a lower level of crime in the new system, right? This is an additional incentive. And you can say, hey, look, we're going after them for abusing rights from yesterday, but we're also going after them, and well, you don't have to say it, well, you probably will say it, but we're also going after them because we're going to clean up the streets today, okay? So, now, notice here that I've relegated secondary actors really to a wild card, because again, they don't control the allocation of political goods, so it's hard to say where they're going to fall in terms of justice policies. They could follow their own ideology, their private preferences. If it's the new elites, I assume they want the most aggressive forms of justice. But it could be that if justice is unpopular, they could go out for populism, right? And they could be opponents of justice because it's not popular. It's a wild card. Doesn't mean these actors are irrelevant, because they're not. Secondary actors can have an important role in influencing the justice process in a couple ways. They can use agenda setting. They can use issue linkages. They can use a variety of tactics to create public political pressure, which would affect the primary actors right up here. Okay. So what this means is that ultimately, at the second stage, the configuration of justice preferences across institutions is what helps us determine what output we're going to have. So we'll start with the very simple ones in this corner and that corner, where secondary actors and primary actors support aggressive forms of justice. We should expect to find what I call expedited justice, quick, aggressive forms of criminal prosecutions, okay? And perhaps large scale. Where they both oppose justice, down here, we should expect to find what I call impeded justice, where aggressive forms of justice are off the books. Again, transitional justice is a misnomer. So off the books means for this year, for maybe in 5 years it'll come back, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 100 years it'll come back. It's probably going to come back. That's our experience. Now, where secondary actors are in favor of aggressive forms of justice, right here, but primary actors are opposed to them. Where secondary actors are opposed to them, and primary actors are in favor, what we should expect to find is sluggish justice. Because the secondary actors can, again, influence public opinion. They can make it tough for the primary actors to follow their preferential policy. but the primary actors are the ones with their fingers on the button, and they can go forward. It's just going to be a slower, more painful process, and not as aggressive. Okay? So we should expect to find things like criminal prosecutions, but not many of them, perhaps, not as quickly, perhaps. Now, where secondary actors are in favor of aggressive justice and primary actors are opposed to justice, what we should expect to find is what I call abortive justice, where primary actors are essentially veto players, and they're going to water down any sort of justice policies that come out of the secondary actors' institutions. Secondary actors might say, let's go after all the rights abusers, let's throw them all in jail, and the primary actors will somehow water that down and say, well, let's do an investigation and slap them on the wrist or something. Okay? So that's the idea. So in a nutshell, I know it's a lot. Okay? There's the book. Don't buy it. I only get $2 for each book. You can go get it at the library. What I want you to get is that relative power, which is these various relative power arguments, which are really the ones that dominate the literature, tend to focus on justice as a function of the political elites in power. Again, the relative power of the old and the new, the players in the new system. Here, what I'm looking at is the players in the new system, but also the rules of the game. And so the players in the system, in the new system, yeah, if there are a lot of old elites, they can impact this, but they're not going to necessarily be the deciding factors. I'll demonstrate in the case of Poland. So, in order to actually go about testing this, the first thing I did is I went through the secondary literature for a very long time and pulled out a bunch of transitional justice policies that have been used in a variety of states, outside of the country cases that I was going to look at. And then I ranked them. I put them in order in a hierarchy based on two things. One, the degree to which they personalize responsibility, individualize responsibility, and two, the severity of the repercussions. So each step up this transitional justice spectrum involves more personalized responsibility and more severe repercussions. So I'm going to go over this very quickly, and we can talk about this some other time if you want, like later on. But we'll start with stopping rights abuses, codifying them, putting them into law, often through taking on international law. And putting that into your constitution. Well, what does that do? It stops. It's not particularly painful for the old elites, right? It does say that you were doing something wrong. This is the new way, but it doesn't really bother them so much. A rebuke of the old system. What I mean is apologies or condemnations. Now, this is a little more a finger in your face sort of thing. Notice what I'm emphasizing here is retributive effects of each one of these. You'll notice that as I go up because it's more severe repercussions, more individualized. So here you're saying all of you who are up to no good, we're apologizing, we're condemning what happened, okay? Or we're forcing an apology in some circumstances, right? Well, that's bad, but I was a cog in the machine, what can I do? Rehabilitation and compensation, what this refers to is giving people back their civil rights where they were denied after, for example, you were in jail for a while, giving people compensation, returning their property, providing them for compensation for their jail time, for the torture, whatever it is. Well, this opens up on the retributive front a new question, which is, well, it's in the public debate now. So if you were hurt, who did it, right? And so this begins this public discourse, and names might come up. Truth Commission's names are more frequently going to come up, right? There's someone called it something great, like, I'm not going to remember what they called it, but this is, in many ways, this is a form of retributive justice, because if you're humiliated up there on the Truth Commission, if you have to tell people what you did, and suddenly it turns out, well, your family didn't know that you were involved in the torture, that you were involved in the meetings, and suddenly your family isn't happy, your friends aren't happy, you're ostracized, well, that is retributive, okay? Then we go about period of purges, and I don't mean Stalinist-style purges, throw everyone out. I mean looking for individual human rights abusers and pushing them out of their state positions. And then prosecutions. Okay? And I separate these into prosecutions for those who pulled the trigger and those who gave the orders at the very top. Okay? So I took this transitional justice spectrum and I dropped it into 4 quite different countries: Poland, Serbia, Croatia, and Uzbekistan. The idea was this was really a theory infirming and confirming case study approach, where what I was looking for is how this played out in each one of these individual countries, and then how can we compare, how can we bring the lessons forward based on these various cases. Right? So all these do face accountability in the context of radical political and economic reform. They face similar communist era rights abuses. There are lots of similarities. They have quite similar political cultures, broadly understood. High levels of elitism, low levels of civil society and participation. but they differ in important ways as well. Transition type, the types of abuses after the system, internal and external pressures for justice. Okay. So you are what you eat. I'll just give you a brief idea of how I went about doing this. The first thing I did is I went through international and local media, and I was looking for context, trying to figure out what happened where, because you're not going to find this in a big data set somewhere. You need to actually soak and poke and dig and all that, and so that's what I did. Besides establishing context, I was looking for key players. Okay? So this is, if any of you are going to grad school and are going to follow qualitative methods, this is really important. You have to dig around, and then that's how you start uncovering some of the key players, and then you can go about doing interviews. So I interviewed about 250 elites in these various countries, many of whom had their hands, again, on the trigger, who were actually in powerful positions in order to influence this process. And so I talked to the first couple of non-communist prime ministers in Poland. I talked to the first non-communist internal affairs minister, first non-communist justice minister. Same thing in Serbia, another case I'll talk about, where I talked to the first 3 deputies of the non-Milosevic prime minister, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are people who were very close to these issues. Okay? And so what I was doing, really, is I was looking for patterns. I was looking for their stories, their perceptions. What happened? Why did this happen? And then I was looking, and I was mixing and matching. I was trying to establish some sort of pattern. And I quickly found patterns in each of these cases, which I'll tell you about with respect to 2 of the cases right now. So, you can't see that, but I'll take it that first. So, Poland is really the quintessential Central European country when it comes to this transition. It was a negotiated transition. What it was this powerful, powerful social movement, Solidarity, which was composed of workers, also intellectuals, also peasants, who forced the communists to the negotiating table, right? This big round table, a round table. What happened during that period is that the communists promised to transition semi-free elections in 1989, but they ensured for themselves a role in the new state. They ensured that only 65% of seats in the primary House of Parliament would actually be eligible, only 35% seats would actually be eligible for Solidarity, so they would control 65%, a majority of seats in the lower House of Parliament. As a result, they were in the primary institutions, they dominated. They controlled the lower House of Parliament. They gave Solidarity opportunities to win the upper house, and Solidarity won everything it could. Okay? They controlled the presidency. They controlled the defense ministry, the internal affairs ministry. They controlled powerful places. Negotiated transition. From a relative power perspective, there's no reason we should have expected to find criminal accountability here, criminal justice. No way. It's a negotiated transition. The old elites were quite powerful in the state apparatus in these primary institutions. The puzzle comes in here because within 2 months, Solidarity actually pushed through, past communists in their own primary House of Parliament, a bill that would actually allow for an investigation and criminal prosecutions of those responsible for rights abuses under communism. Quite odd. Even odder is that within a year or so, Solidarity members actually pursued what I call an abortive policy. In other words, secondary actors pursued aggressive forms of justice that Solidarity members in the primary institutions actually watered down. And they didn't want to go anywhere towards justice, towards aggressive justice anymore. And what's weird about this is this kept occurring even after 1991 when Solidarity consolidated power through 1993. So I'll walk you through this pretty quickly. This is what I refer to when I'm talking about this aggressive form of justice. It was an investigation. It was a quote-unquote truth commission come prosecutorial investigation. So what this was is Solidarity authorized these commissions to be formed to look into more than 100 deaths in the 1980s of Solidarity activists. Right? And what they said is that this is going to be for the public, so that's the truth commission side, but also wherever we find wrongdoing, we're going to send it on for criminal prosecutions. And ultimately, they sent 85% of these cases on to the prosecutor's office. Okay, this was clearly, in the words of Bronisław Geremek, who was the head of Solidarity's political side, there was this feeling that crime should be punished. They went aggressively forward with criminal prosecutions within 2 months of taking power, despite the fact that the communists. Now, everything else after that, I'm not going to get into these. I'll talk about this last one. But these were all initiatives that Solidarity members in the Senate put out aggressive forms of justice that Solidarity members in this lower house of parliament, watered down, that they made much less consequential. And so just to give you an example, I'll talk about the last one, the Chief Commission for the Investigation of Atrocities Against the Polish People. This was an institution that was established under the communists to look into Nazi-era rights abuses. In 1991, the Parliament passed a law that would widen this to deal with all communist-era rights abuses up until 1956. This is when the worst of the abuses ended. Okay, this is the Stalinist period ended at this point. Now, what's important here is that some wanted to go further, namely those in the Senate. And they wanted to address all abuses up until 1989. Because in the words of one senator, if we accept the date of December 31st, 1956, then we ex cathedra state that after that date, there was no repression. No repression. So they aggressively fought this. Solidarity members, their best buddies in the Senate, in this lower house of parliament, this primary institution, said, sorry, we're not going to do that. And they watered it down. And so they left it in 1956. So now we can talk about why. Well, look, let's start with the 1989 period, when you had this aggressive commission, this investigation, okay, that leads to prosecutions. What happened? Well, Solidarity activists in the same and in the Senate, okay, the primary house and the lower house, this primary institution and this secondary institution, were all pursuing their private preferences. They all wanted aggressive forms of justice, and so they did. Why did they do this? Well, look, this was the summer before economic bills were tabled. It was the summer before the reforms were actually on the agenda, and so they were quite free to do whatever they wanted to. They weren't going to get hurt one way or another. Now, the post-communists, who actually dominated this, why would they accept this? Well, they accepted this because they saw that Solidarity got every seat, practically, allocated that it was eligible for in the most recent semi-free elections. They saw Solidarity as a wave that was coming up to sweep them away. Yeah, they had more power now, but the point was Solidarity was coming. It might not be this year, it might be next year, whenever maybe the Prime Minister's going to call a vote of no confidence, new elections, we're going to get reamed. So the idea for the post-communists was to accept harsh, aggressive forms of justice for a few of the worst, then to allow for less aggressive but much more far-reaching justice for everybody else. Okay? Anybody who was a member of the Communist Party, for example. One member of Parliament from Solidarity told me, I'll tell you what she told me, they knew there would be new elections and that they would lose. Blocking justice could end in a lustration law. Lustration referring to a process where essentially depending on where it happened, a purge of everyone from collaborators to the secret police all the way up to communist decommunization. Okay? So they were afraid of this. So here again, private preferences. All this changes within several months. Okay? And now, again, why did this happen? The economic crisis came to the fore. These guys had to get this political goods legislation out there. What were the political goods? Well, at this point, the political goods were the economic reforms, improving the prospects of the voters. So, we'll start here with the senators. Secondary institution, very little to do with the allocation of political goods. And they didn't change a bit. They kept favoring aggressive forms of justice, okay, even after this period. And they were the ones who, as I mentioned before, put all these aggressive forms of justice on the table in Parliament. Okay? And one of them, a senator who was actually the head of the commission, told me, they knew this wasn't popular. He told me, the problem of repression only concerned a certain fraction of society. It was just the problem of a certain political elite. But that was these guys in the Senate. Many of them had been repressed. So they continued to push forward. Now, their colleagues in the same said no. They said, no. If you want criminal justice, we're not going to go all the way up to 1989. We'll stop at 1956. Because anyone who was alive before then and was involved in those things is not in power right now. We don't have to worry about them. The point was that Solidarity members of the same were more constrained because they had to get these economic reforms passed. To get them passed, they needed the 65% that were somehow linked to the old regime. Okay? One same member from Solidarity told me, there was a climate in which we felt we had to concentrate on economic issues, on the free market. The Senate was more about pretty talk. So that was justice, pretty talk. So again, to highlight here, what we see is actors, these are all the same actors. They're all coming out of Solidarity. And they all support aggressive forms of justice until political goods is at stake. Okay? When that happens, you have an institutional schism. Solidarity members in the Senate continued to push these things forward, and Solidarity members in the same said, whoa, we can't do this. Okay? And what you had was this transformation. from expedited justice to aborted justice. I'll note just in passing here that Solidarity was out of power from 1993 to 1997 when the post-communists came into power. 1997, Solidarity comes back with a vengeance, and they pursue very aggressive forms of justice. Essentially going back and authorizing criminal investigations all the way up to 1989, like some of them had wanted before. Why? Well, it's probably not a coincidence that this is a period when Poland was seen as the quote-unquote tiger of Central Europe in terms of the economic status. And so they could afford to do this thing. So let me go through Yugoslavia quickly. There's a consensus in the former Yugoslavia among political elites who I talked to that there were abuses under communism, but generally communism was pretty good down there. And the abuses that happened under communism really paled in comparison to what they had in the 1990s during the civil wars. Right? Civil wars, which became international wars quickly. So here I'm going to focus in particular in this presentation, largely in my book, not entirely. I'm going to focus on criminal accountability for the 1990s rights violations. So really what we're talking about is cooperation with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. This is what I call a faux revolution in Serbia and Yugoslavia, okay? Which you have to understand, by this point it was Serbia and Montenegro. So I call it Yugoslavia, it's really Serbia. Now it's really just Serbia. What happened is masses took to the streets protesting electoral fraud, protesting corruption, protesting a number of things that we've seen in the Middle East most recently. And they swept Slobodan Milosevic, the head of Yugoslavia, from power. Well, that's great, but this wasn't a revolution, because the Serb Republic, which accounts for 90% of Yugoslavia's population, experienced a negotiated transition. It was about 3 weeks of the old elites negotiating with the opposition, trying to hammer out some agreement which led to new elections and changes in Serbia itself. Okay? So this was a negotiated transition. Now, from all accounts, from the relative power perspective, we shouldn't have seen aggressive justice in Serbia and Montenegro. The old regime, again, it was a negotiated transition. There's evidence that there were some guarantees of amnesty, informal guarantees of amnesty. We won't deal with this issue. By the oppositionists, the new elites. The old regime dominated in the state apparatus. The military and police, which were responsible for most of the rights abuses during the war years, were practically unchanged. So the new guys got into power, and they said, wait a second, I remember talking to the chief of staff of the Internal Affairs Ministry, and he said, we were so alone in that building. It was just us two and the rest of them. Okay, how were we supposed to go about doing this? Well, they did go about doing it. And this is a surprise. Let me just add that to boot, public opinion was very much anti-cooperation with the ICTY. So it was politically unpopular. Yet they followed what I call sluggish justice, slow but aggressive, harsh forms of justice. And what I mean is that between 2001 and 2003, the prime minister from the opposition, this new elite, Zoran Đinđić, arrested and transferred to The Hague 20+ high-level indictments, including Milosevic, including the former Serb president, Milutinovic, including the former army chief of staff, Vojdani. These were high-level people that they sent off to The Hague. This is a big deal, because there were major disincentives. When you don't look at their institutions, there are major disincentives to cooperating with The Hague. And I focus on two particular actors here. The post-opposition is this new elite in the primary institution, Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić, and the president, also a former oppositionist, who was in this secondary institution, which I'll talk about, the president, Vojislav Koštunica. Koštunica and Đinđić had no reason to cooperate with The Hague. They had lots of reasons not to cooperate with The Hague. They seemed to be personally against it. Đinđić, Koštunica was the most aggressive. He called it monstrous, despicable, counterproductive. Đinđić openly, in front of his public, questioned the veracity of Hague indictments, saying he wasn't in favor of these things. It was incredibly unpopular. Let me emphasize, Đinđić and Koštunica wanted to see Milosevic sit in prison, but they wanted to see him sit not in Hotel Hague, but they wanted to see him, that's what they call it, they wanted to see him sit in a Belgrade prison for corruption, not for human rights violations, crimes against humanity, genocide, but for corruption at home. And this was what was popular. On the eve of Milosevic's extradition in 2001, about 11% supported his extradition to The Hague. More than 60% wanted to see him in prison for corruption at home. So it was politically unpopular, and it was also very risky. Zoran Đinđić, this prime minister, faced police protests. He faced a mutiny at one point from the police, and he was ultimately killed, assassinated, probably as a result of his Hague cooperation policies. The only thing going for Hague cooperation was Western pressure, conditionality, diplomatic and economic. Diplomatic, what was a key political good in Serbia? A key political good was European Union entry. That's what everybody wanted. We get into the EU, scot-free. Everything's going to be better. Okay? Economic conditionality. The EU was saying if you want into the EU, you're going to cooperate with The Hague. Economic conditionality. Here we're talking about billions of dollars that were at stake in terms of Western aid. If you want this Western aid, you need to cooperate. So here's how this played out. We'll start with President Koštunica. Secondary institution. This was the head of a feeble federation. He had very little to do with actually running the state. And in fact, one of Đinđić's advisors told me in exasperation that Koštunica, quote, had absolutely no responsibility for running the country, which meant that Koštunica wasn't going to get credit for the country joining the EU. He wasn't going to get blamed for the country not joining the EU. Ditto on the economic stuff. He wasn't going to get credit for all the money coming in or get blamed for it not coming in because he couldn't control these resources. Right? He wasn't responsible for this. And so he took a politically popular policy, which was to oppose Hague cooperation. Look up at this guy, Zoran Đinđić, the prime minister, who's responsible for pulling Serbia out of economic crisis. Đinđić needed this conditioned Western economic aid. He said, we didn't have, one of his deputies told me, we didn't have electricity when we came to power, and we weren't professional politicians. We needed help. These are guys like you and me, who literally come to, a lot of them were professors. Suddenly they became the heads of state, and they had to say, well, wow, how do we do this? Okay? And so they needed help. So the public was anti-Hague. The flames were being fanned by this guy, who was himself a moderate nationalist. So this probably appealed to him as well to go against the Hague. But what this meant is public opinion was very much antagonistic to cooperating with this. And it meant it was very difficult for them to do. And what you get was this sluggish pattern. Again, this slow chain of handovers. But it's literally like pulling teeth. They happen, but they happened very slowly and under great duress, under Western demands. And this conditionality was clear, very clear. It was manifested in a couple ways. First of all, Đinđić and his associates, they weren't ashamed. They publicly said, hey, look, we're doing this because we need the money. They didn't say it like that, but they said, a typical quote from Đinđić, we do not have the luxury of losing needed economic aid for not collaborating with the court in The Hague. And the timing of extraditions was right there. The timing was right up when a Western deadline was impending, when they had no choice. And again, Đinđić said things like, without cooperation, not only will this country be shaken, it'll be isolated. We don't have a choice. This was so clear that a pro-ICTY newspaper that I was using for my media analysis, actually on the day after Milosevic was extradited, they published this headline, big headline, and this is a pro-ICTY newspaper, not a cynic. They said, Milosevic, Serbia's #1 foreign export. And that's exactly what he was. Okay? So the correlation was quite clear. Now, here's what we all like. We like natural experiments. Right? And the natural experiment here, the perfect thing would be, what if President Koštunica, this hate monger in terms of The Hague, we want nothing to do with it. What if he suddenly took on a position of responsibility? Well, Đinđić gets shot and killed in 2003. A year later, President Koštunica becomes Prime Minister Koštunica. And he does exactly what we would expect to find him doing from a strategic perspective. Let me emphasize here that when he took the Prime Minister position, the public opinion remained anti-Hague. People hated the thing. There's no sign that he had some personal or spiritual turnaround. The old elites were even more powerful than they had been before, having won lots of seats in the 2003 elections. Right? Yet within a year of taking power, he begins to carry out what they call voluntary surrenders, which were really handovers to The Hague. Okay? And he did this in the context of an impending EU deadline. The EU said, you want accession negotiations, you're going to start cooperating this year, now. And he did it. Okay? And he said the same sorts of things that Đinđić said. It's in the interest of our country. Okay? Clearly, it was not personality, it was not ideology, it was not the strength of the old regime, it was the institutions that changed his preferences. So again, just to summarize from this case, what we see is the political goods are out there. The political goods are EU entry and all this Western money. Okay? It's all conditioned. Okay? So to do this, actors in the primary institutions did something incredibly painful. They took a gamble, right? They did something incredibly unpopular, hoping that sooner or later, when it came to the next elections, their constituents were going to vote with their pocketbooks and say, yeah, you did something that humiliated us, that infuriated us, but life is better as a result. Big gamble. Ginger's lost his life on it. Kostunica did pretty well. Now again, they were slowed down in their cooperation by the fact that they had these secondary pressures working against them, actors in secondary institutions who could profit from this not happening. Okay? So just to conclude here, really what we're talking about in all these cases is justice policies that are a function, again, of these elite perceptions of how the public of public expectations and demands, which are impacted by institutional placement. So again, in Serbia, in Poland, what do you see? Well, you see primary actors who are pursuing aggressive forms of justice until it suddenly gets in the way of providing these political goods, then they back down. Secondary actors kept it on the agenda, and they had to water down whatever was coming out of the secondary actors' institutions. In Serbia, again, the same thing, where primary actors, actually in this case, were actually pursuing justice, aggressive forms of justice, in the hope that they would be able to provide additional political goods as a result of this. So, very quickly, let's look at the Middle East today. Come on, let's look, please. Just look. There we go. Okay. So what did we find after these revolutions? Okay. Now we've all seen that Egypt is far from done. Okay. But what we found is pretty consistent with the strategic argument. I mean, look, these were certainly in Tunisia. This was a revolution, right? And in Egypt, it seemed like a revolution. Okay. The military stuck around, which complicates things. But for Tunisia, what we should have seen is the old elites again hanging from some sort of large structure. Okay. Instead, what we saw was that new leaders have pursued justice that they can show demonstrates that they're working to deliver on public demands. Okay? And in particular, the political goods here are an end to corruption. So what was the first thing the Tunisians did? They launched a commission to investigate presidential corruption. Right? And then ultimately, they launched another commission to investigate 80 deaths in just the most recent protest wave. Okay? Egypt, same thing, prosecutions for those accused of corruption. And then eventually they said, okay, well, we'll throw in human rights too, after the corruption trials are over. No one's been arrested for torture, for extrajudicial murder, things that happened for decades in each of these regimes, right? No one. And the argument here is that the costs of these sorts of justice are just too high, right? They're not connected to the political goods right now. Sooner or later, though, when transparency and an end to corruption are no longer what's really occupying people's minds, I'm pretty sure that they're going to come back to these guys, and these guys are going to get it for human rights abuses. Because again, transitional justice is not always just, but it's very rarely transitional. It will come around. So thanks for those of you who didn't close your eyes, and thank you for some of you who closed your eyes. So I'll take questions, comments, anything? There's got to be something. Talking about that. Yeah.
I'm not sure about the political goods. The examples of both Poland and Serbia seemed, a lot of it was driven actually by notions of nationality and national identity. I'm not sure if you're simply going to call that a political good, but the old stuff about Poland was in the sense in 1956, which they could always blame it on the Russians. Right. And so in the sense, a lot of the variety of opinion was where you lined up. Right. In terms of that. So in other words, a lot of the notion of looking for justice was connected with, you could, as long as you could blame the Russians for everything, it was fine. And Serbia's whole sort of mentality for the last 20 years has really been a sort of felt aggrieved, put upon by the rest of the world. In other words, there was a national discourse about national identity. I'm not sure, is that simply just a political good? Or
No, and I think that's a great point. And one of the things that I do in this presentation is I try to overstate my argument just to put it out there. Because in reality, transitional justice is very messy. Now, where I would put that within this is I would put that within the public constraints, within how the public thinks about these things. I mean, there are lots of things that would sort of fall in there within those parameters. So I think you could take account of that looking at this also. But I think it's a really important point, which is that nationality questions were important in both of these issues. Absolutely. Yeah.
it kind of follows up on that. I'm a historian, so the manipulation of nationalism is, I think, very important. It's not just responding to it from below, but of course it's being manipulated from above.
Right.
And also the fear of outside intervention. I work on denazification and have looked at de-Ba'athification, and I just wonder, when you look at a military occupation versus something that's happening from within without military occupation, but perhaps the threat of intervention, either economic or military, how does that change the model?
Right. Okay, so that was the purpose of putting Serbia and Croatia in here, to compare Poland and Serbia and Croatia from that perspective. How do international pressures affect these things? Well, again, I mean, the way you could say that international pressures in many ways fomented nationalism, really got nationalism going. At the same time, what it came down to again, the data is based on these political elites telling me what drove them to do things and not to do things. And what it came down to is that, we were pushed up against the wall. We had to provide these things to the voters at the end of the day. And so, like I said, in the case of Serbia, the same thing in Croatia. They did very unpopular things where they saw that they could ultimately benefit as a result of providing these political goods. So I see your point, and it's a good one. So what would have happened if they didn't have these outside pressures in Serbia and Croatia? Well, I can guarantee you there wouldn't have been cooperation with The Hague. But a lot of these people would have been sitting in jail for other crimes within these countries themselves. Which raises another important issue, which is why do we limit transitional justice? And we do, primarily to political and civil rights abuses, right? Instead of economic rights abuses. Why isn't corruption more dominant within the literature? And that's something that I'm actually sort of looking at now. But it's a good question. I mean, it comes out when you look at Tunisia, when you look at Egypt, when you look at probably what will happen in Libya as well, as a consolidated power, et cetera. I mean, economic crimes are up there, and we've got an international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. Why have we paid less attention? Probably because the transitional justice literature is based in Western countries, and same with the policy proponents. But yeah, so I agree. Yeah.
Do you mind touching on what you found in Uzbekistan in terms of when you were doing your investigations there?
Yeah. So Uzbekistan, I got a little slide for Uzbekistan and Croatia. There's Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan's a really interesting case because this is a case where we shouldn't have seen any justice whatsoever. In fact, when I went there, what I expected to focus on was the first stage of my transitional justice spectrum, stopping rights abuses, okay, and codifying them. And instead what I found, again, soaking and poking, you find these things. I literally wandered across a museum for victims of repression. I said, wait a second. And so then I found out that the head of the museum, he was in some office like somewhere over there in Tashkent, and I tracked him down, and he was the head of a commission, a truth commission that Uzbekistan had launched to look into rights abuses under the communist period. It was really interesting. It wasn't just under the communist period, because that would have suggested that the communists who were still in power, aka the President Karimov, who was the party's first secretary and then president of the country after quote unquote, well, the transition, it was a transition backwards really. That would suggest that he was culpable. So what they did is they looked into crimes by the Russians, right? So looking at the imperial times, so going back to the 18th and 19th century, the end of the 18th century. So mostly the 19th century and then 20th century, but everything, even under communist times, was geared towards the crimes the Russians did against us. So much so to the point that Karimov was able to actually demonstrate through this truth commission that he and his colleagues were actually victims of of Russian aggression under the Soviet times. There was this cotton scandal that they referred to as it was a corruption scandal that the Uzbeks were involved in, and they showed this as the Russians targeting them, the Uzbeks. And so really what they did is they flipped it on the side. Having said that, they really did uncover a lot of true abuses from Stalinism, from when communism was launched in Uzbekistan to before that period. So there was a real truth commission. You can't say it wasn't a real truth commission. And the reason they did that, I think, is because, just to go back to this point right here, is that President Karimov needed Western support pretty badly in 1999 when they launched this thing. He was on the U.S.'s good side, liked to be on the U.S.'s good side. They historically have played Russia and the United States off each other. The pendulum was swinging back towards the U.S. They were getting cozy with the United States, but the United States kept kicking them and saying, hey, what about all these human rights abuses? Why do you have all these political prisoners in jail? And this was a great way for Karimov to, and it was launched 3 months before a commission, this Uzbekistan-US commission that always gives the Uzbeks a bunch of money. It was a great way for Karimov to say, hey, look, we do commit human rights abuses, and that's bad, but number one, we're addressing it. Look, we've launched a truth commission to deal with all of our past rights abuses. And number two, this shows that it's not our fault we're human rights abusers, it's the trajectory that the Russians set for us. And we're trying to shake this from our system, we just can't. But they did this in the face of Western incentives. I doubt they would have launched this if the West hadn't been kicking them about their current persecutions. So, yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that you looked at the press, obviously, but I assume the press was part of the public opinion, and I assume there's high-level press and low-level press, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you used the media in your research.
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, what this wasn't a content analysis. In fact, I started to do that in the case of Poland, to look at letters to the editor and things like that. What I was really doing is I was just digging around in the newspapers that would have been most, the official record newspapers, or in the case of Serbia, I actually used pro-ICTY newspapers because I was looking for anything that had anything to do with justice. So literally anything that had anything to do with justice. I was just trying to get the context for why this was thrown out there, who were the opponents, who were the proponents, what were they saying in favor and against, just trying to get the context, because you can't find, again, from a data set, what happened and where. And so I wanted to come into the interviews knowing what happened where. And often it turned out that I was the one who knew about these things, some of the less consequential things perhaps, and a lot of the interviewees didn't. For example, in Poland, many of them didn't know that there had been a general rebuke of communism in 1999. Two of my interviewees knew because they were on the Human Rights Committee that actually got that going. But most other people didn't even know, so it was clearly not particularly important. But anyway, so that's how I used the media. I was looking basically for the best coverage of rights abuses and dealing with rights abuses. So it wasn't a content analysis, instead it was getting context. Yeah?
Do you typically find what the processes of deciding transitional justice fairly transparent to the people?
Okay, so that depends. Transparent to the people. Well, I'll give you a great example of how it can be non-transparent. In Serbia, they launched a truth commission, and in Croatia, they launched a truth commission. Both of these governments launched truth commissions because they were getting kicked by Western states for not cooperating with The Hague. And so they said, well, look, we can do this all on our own. We're going to launch truth commissions, and after that, we'll have our own criminal prosecutions, so why don't you guys leave us alone? So with respect to the Serbia Truth Commission, I find this one particularly amusing because of its ending, because it was almost an embarrassing ending for me. I talked to a lot of these people on the Truth Commission. They produced nothing. They were set up as this sort of almost like a pseudo-truth commission in order to get the West off their back. And they spent, I think it was a year and a half operating. They never produced a single report. They didn't have any real investigations. I talked to these guys. They were under-resourced. They didn't have, Kostunica, the president, launched this truth commission to fight Djindjic and his Hague tribunal cooperations, but they barely got a budget. All they had were secondary sources to go over. And so they didn't talk in public, so transparency, well, not a lot of transparency. And then suddenly at the end of, I can't remember which year, 2003, I think, it just disappeared because there was no funding anymore, and that was it. And so I got onto their webpage at one point, and I saw nothing much. And then I got onto the same webpage again a year and a half later after I had been in Serbia, and it was a porno site. Like, wow. I was like, what are you doing? Research? Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm noticing a sort of trend between how there was these democratic movements after the fall of the wall and communism, and then there's democratic movements now with the Arab Spring. Does this sort of institutional change in transitional democracy only occur with these waves of movements, or can they occur like in isolated areas?
Yeah, so transitional justice can actually, it's another misnomer about transitional justice. Again, in transitional justice, it's not always just. But often new leaders have come to power and they'll say that they represent a new regime. Actually, Uzbekistan's a case in point. Karimov said, this is a new regime, this is a democratizing regime, and clearly it wasn't. I mean, the period of democracy was the period of glasnost and perestroika under the Soviet period. After that, things went downhill. And anyone in Uzbekistan will tell you that things got much worse once they gained independence in terms of political freedoms and economically as well. It's when there's a leadership transition and people declare. That's why, if you noted at the very beginning, I didn't flesh this out, but my research question is about new and nominally new regimes. Because that's sort of like the little dirty secret in transitional justice. That lots of non-democratic states have actually pursued the same sorts of things that many transitional justice scholars tout as very important for democratizing states to do. And they've done this sometimes in legitimate ways. In other words, they've talked about real rights violations, but for illegitimate goals, okay, to bolster their own power, to get rid of enemies, et cetera, et cetera. So they've talked about real abuses, but then they've gone on abusing. Yeah?
When you were doing your research, did at all you look at the level of injustice that did that have any effect on the the search for justice after the transition?
Well, I mean, you would think so. Yes. I guess it did. So when it comes to quality and severity of repercussions, these are variables that are out there in the literature. There was an impact, but it was kind of confusing. I mean, for example, in Poland. The political impetus was to actually, I mentioned that Solidarity came back into power in 1997 and passed an aggressive form of justice that said, go after all rights abuses up to 1989. I went into the institution that was actually tasked with doing this, and they were still caught up in all the pre-1956 rights abuses because they had a policy that once they open an investigation, they don't close it until they're finished, even if the people who they're investigating are dead. Okay? So this just goes on and on and on, so they're overworked. Which isn't necessarily what you would expect. That's another example of that. So what you did find, and sort of like what we see in Egypt today, and what we saw in Tunisia at least, is a focus on the most recent rights violations by political types. So again, the investigation launched within a couple of months of taking power by Solidarity looked at 1980s rights abuses. Didn't look at pre-1956. They didn't get to that until 1991 when they passed this law. So maybe that's an important aspect. And again, in Serbia and Croatia, they barely even looked into past rights abuses because they focused so much on the 1990s. It's almost inconsequential what happened under communism to many of them. Of course, it's not inconsequential. They'll come back to it. But as of right now. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in Serbia, they were definitely looking at the most severe and most recent rights abuses. In Poland, severity didn't seem to matter. They were looking at the most recent abuses, not necessarily the most severe, except when you got into these institutions. But what the public was demanding, what political elites were demanding was different. Yeah?
When a repressive leader and his party gets thrown out
When
a repressive leader and his party gets thrown out of politics, but there are other strong co-equal branches that remain, like the Egyptian military.
Right, okay.
How does that influence the potential for justice forms?
Well, so that's a good question. Let me talk about the case of Egypt. In Egypt, they did pursue certain levels of justice. They had the opening up of files, of police files. But again, that's, and I'm not an expert on Egypt by any sense of the imagination, but from what I read, the military and the police have historically been added in Egypt, and so this was a great way for the military to delegitimize the police and strengthen itself. But would they go after the military? No. I mean, as long as the military is still, controlling something. Now, having said that, we can go back to these institutions, and this goes back to the state structure approach, right? What about only elites within these institutions? Egypt's different because you still have the military in power. But what about when they're not in power, when they're the civilians who are over them? Well, in these cases, you can be surprised. I mean, there have been purges. I mean, both in Poland and in Serbia, they had purges of these state institutions that were dominated by old elite associates. So yeah, I mean, it can impact justice depending on the. It can definitely impact justice, but in the cases that I've seen, it doesn't necessarily have to, which I think is important. Yeah.
You mentioned Tunisia, you just talked about Egypt. What kinds of recommendations based on your findings would you make for this policy?
I don't know if I'd make recommendations on how to make policy, but I would. But in terms of if we were trying to push them to pursue one type of justice or another. It's really about incentives. It's really about how you incentivize it and present it as allowing for them to provide something more to their citizens so they can sell it to their citizens. Now in Egypt that's not even relevant yet because the military is still in control, but certainly in Tunisia that would be relevant. And I'll just give you one more quick example. In Serbia, something that we didn't do, we were throwing all this money at The Hague. But then once an NGO got together and they put up all these, it was, I think 2002, they put up all these very aggressive posters all around town showing these bloody victims from the wars that say we need to cooperate with The Hague. The US ambassador freaked out, called up Freedom House because Freedom House, through a USAID grant, had given these people money, and he said, you need to get them to take that down right now because it's inflammatory. Well, what were we trying to do? If we were actually trying to influence public opinion, that wasn't a bad thing to let them do. It's not like the US was handing out leaflets, right? It was an NGO. But I think that's what needs to happen if we want, it's one way to go about it. Another way is to provide other incentives or to make the connections for these people that the elites aren't necessarily making for one reason or another.
I'd like to thank Professor Grodsky and invite you all to stay for refreshments and to continue the discussion on small groupings.
Thank you very much. No.